The final topic that we're going to have a look at in terms of judging whether an act is ethical or not, or a decision or a behaviour is ethical or not, is that of rights. So Kant was very specific and in his approach, in his deontological approach to ethics. And often we don't see that coming through in business. Instead, what we tend to see is the use of different deontological approaches, such as rights. Now, it shares a lot in common with Kant in the fact that it looks at the act itself rather than the consequences per se, but there are some important differences as well. So why don't we hop in and have a look at it? So the idea of rights springs from Kant's idea that we're rational and that therefore there are certain moral principles, these absolute moral principles that we should always follow. One way to, there's many different examples of the idea of rights, but we're going to deal with the idea of human rights because we talk about them a lot or read about them in the paper, etc. What are they based on? Where do they come from? And what do they mean in terms of ethical behaviour? So when we have a right, which is an entitlement to get something or have something, then it also means that someone else has a duty to deliver what's necessary for that right. So that's where it kind of fits in with Kant. You know, Kant is about these duties that we have to behave in a certain way. And if we do that, then people have a right to be treated in a certain way. It's the mirror image of the duty. Sometimes these rights are actually supported by law, sometimes they're not. And of course, where they're supported by law, they're legal rights. So just like we were talking about the law and ethics, we have moral rights and we have legal rights. And hopefully there's a huge overlap between the two, a bit bigger than what I've got here demonstrating it, but hopefully there's a huge overlap. But there are areas where we might have a moral right that is not yet a legal right. Many people actually believe that there are human rights that everyone has regardless of what the law actually says. How do we tell if someone has a human right? Well, a human right is something that should be universal. That is, it applies to everyone everywhere. That's really, very similar to Kant's universal approach to judging whether something was moral or not. The second is that they're equal, right? So no one should have more than anyone else. We all have access to a certain level, and everyone should have access to, say, a certain level of education, etc. That's our right, and it's equal among everyone. That they're inalienable. Inalienable is really important, right? That you can't transfer that right or you can't give it up. So something like the right to freedom, etc., means you shouldn't be able to give up or transfer the right to someone else. And often that they're natural. So they don't depend on anyone or anything, that these are obvious. Right? They're obvious to a person, as obvious as arithmetic. Okay, so as obvious as maths, as obvious as 1 + 1 = 2. Right? We know that people should be treated this way. So if we have a right that applies to everyone, is equally shared by everyone, is inalienable, is something that they can't sell or transfer or give up, and is obvious, then we'd say that that would be a human right. The most famous use of human rights is by the UN General Assembly Declaration of Human Rights. And it includes a lot of rights. So we've just got a couple of listed here that relate more to business. So everyone has the right to work, to choose where they work, to ensure that the conditions of work are just and favourable. Everyone, without discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. Everyone has the right to be to have just and to be paid fairly, is really what that's saying. That ensures people and their family can live with dignity. Everyone has a right to form and join a trade union to protect his or her interests. So what we can see is that the UN is setting out a series of rights that people have, rights that they believe everyone should have, that they are shared equally, that you can't give up or sell, and that natural or obvious. So these human rights don't provide us with a way of working out what's ethical or not in every situation. But what they do is they give us constraints, or they tell us really what we can't do. So if you judge it against these rights, it gives us an idea about what we're not able to do. And remember that this isn't about implying that these rights lead to overall society being better off, right? These are a deontological approach in the sense that the consequences don't matter. Everyone should have these rights. We should put in place the systems and processes that protect these rights irrespective of the consequences. As with other approaches that we've seen in terms of ethics, there are some problems with this particular approach and the approach of using rights as the basis for judging an ethical act. So the first is that not everyone accepts each of these human rights, and they disagree with how you implement it. I mean, what is a just and fair remuneration? What system do you put in place to ensure everyone has a fair and just remuneration, as one simple example? So even the most fundamental rights, like the right to life. Everyone should have a right to be able to live, but how does that interact with the concepts of a just war, capital punishment, abortion? These are very emotive issues, etc., where we can see people agreeing with the generality of a right to life, but disagreement on where even life starts or ends, and are there limitations to this right to life. A second core problem for moral rights is the idea that they're self-evident. Okay, so it might appear self-evident to us, but is it really self-evident to everyone? At different times, we've believed very different facts, like heavy objects fall faster than light objects. And we know from physics now that they don't, or that the Earth was flat, and we know that it isn't. So these things that may appear obvious, like the Earth is flat, may actually not be true. And in the same way, the morality is bound in time and a culture if we take it to be self-evident. So there are real problems if we rely on it being obvious that someone has a right. Finally, a third key problem, shared by a lot of the other theories that we have in terms of deontology, is that there's no way to determine what to do when certain rights conflict. Okay, so what do we do when we have a difference about the right to work? For instance, maybe we're in an economy where it's very depressed, and the only way to get the people who want to work back to work is to lower wages. Maybe even lower them to a way where, it's a very, very low wage. What's the right thing to do? Have maybe a poverty line wage where people can work, or to pay people justly, but or a level where they can live with a bit more dignity, but not have full employment? These are very complex problems, obviously, and resolving them is one of the reasons why we have different ethical frameworks to think about it. So all up, we've looked at 4 key theories about actions and to how we can determine whether they're moral or ethical or not. Egoism, utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, and moral rights. All of these can be used to judge whether something's ethical or not, and all of them also have problems, which means that on their own, they're likely to be inadequate. We generally use a mix of these approaches when we're making an ethical decision. That's what's called a pluralist test, where we're using more than one approach to help us work out how to make the ethical or moral decision. So all of these approaches provide useful insights into the problems of making a moral decision in a business setting. In general, the key ideas are telling us, look, when we have to make an ethical decision, what we need to think about is how it affects different stakeholders. Like, yes, we've got to think how it affects us as in terms of egoism, but also the stakeholders and who's going to benefit and lose out of this from a utilitarian perspective. But we also probably need to recognize that consequences aren't everything. We also need to think about what our intentions are. Why are we doing it? Are we acting rationally? Are we making sure that we're really not purely doing it for our own benefit and then justifying it? And we also need to make sure that when we make this decision, we're respecting the rights that other stakeholders may have. Finally, we've really only scratched the surface of ethics. There's a whole series of other approaches to ethics that you could have a look at if you're really interested in the area. And we have them listed here. So I hope that's given you some insight into some different models or theories that can help you analyze an ethical dilemma and help us make those difficult ethical decisions. It's not necessarily about deciding to choose which one is the singular way to determine an ethical course of action, but rather the flexibility to be able to look at the multiple ways of approaching the problem. Think about what insight each of these give us, and then balance that with some wisdom and judgment to take the course of action that is ethical and justifiable, both personally and organizationally. Okay, next week we move on from thinking about an action to start talking about the agent, the person making the decision. And that's an entirely different way to think about ethics and morality. It's thinking, hey, what would an ethical person do, rather than whether an act is ethical in and of itself. So look forward to that.